Hello, everyone. Good to have you at CG seminar stroke webinar number 357 in the sequence of every Tuesday and Thursday going back to the first 2 months of the pandemic in 2020. So today we've got Polina Ivanova, and she's going to talk about networks of support, civil society's role in integrating international students in Japan and Australia. Interesting fieldwork and an interesting topic. Relationship between international education and civil society, not much discussed, obviously a really important dimension. We talk about government policy and international education. We talk about institutional strategies and policies and international education, but we don't talk much about civil society. And this is a very important part of the setting that international students experience. I mean, when you look at the international student experience, it's some of its greatest opportunities and problems are outside the campus. They're in the relationship with the community as a whole. And this varies greatly depending on what country you're in, what city you're in, where you are, and how the institution is positioned within civil society as well. Now, Polina, postdoctoral researcher at Ritsumeikan at university in Japan, famous private university in Kyoto, one of I guess the three most important private universities in Japan, along with Waseda and Keio, and in Kyoto, which is the heart of Japan and the most wonderful city in the world, in my opinion, a wonderful place to study and to work. I think I really envy you, Polina. I think that's just a super place to live. You think Barcelona's impressive in Europe? Wow, Kyoto is absolutely stunning, modern and traditional and ancient at the same time. Her research interests lie in the areas of international higher education and migrant integration, an issue which we explored a little in our last webinar. Her forthcoming book, Civil Society and International Students in Japan, The Making of Social Capital, which Routledge are publishing this year, I think, Polina, is based on her doctoral dissertation, which looks at the interaction between civil society groups and international students in Japan. Her postdoctoral research is, of course, on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, not to be missed by any aspiring researcher at this point of time. As a journal editor at Higher Education, we get hundreds of papers still on the impact of the pandemic on teaching and learning, on online education, and so on. Her current project is an edited volume on refugees and asylum seekers in Japan and Taiwan, and that's under contract with Palgrave Macmillan for publication next year. Issue of migration and higher education in Japan, more of an issue than you all might think. There's more migration into Japan than I think is generally realized, and the possibility of further migration, of course, grows as the aging demographic process continues. Polina, at this point, let me hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Simon, for your kind introduction. Can everyone hear me all right? I suppose so. Let me start sharing the screen with you, and please tell me if you can see my screen.
I will do so, Polina, when it comes up.
Thank you.
Yeah, we can see it now, and now it's in full view, yes.
Okay. So let me start maybe from current slide.
Good, now it's perfect.
Okay, thank you so much. So here you can see my topic, networks of support civil society's role in integrating international students in Japan and Australia. And I will be talking about two separate studies. This is my first time to actually present them both in one presentation. So I think there is a partial overlap, but there will be also some kind of inconsistency that you will probably notice. In any case, I will introduce first basic information on international students in both countries and their support organizations, while the first study looks into co-creating social capital in Japan. And that is the basis of the book that Simon kindly mentioned. And the second study is a comparative study between Japan and Australia. and it looks into the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on international students and their support organizations, and basically what solutions the organizations came up with in both countries, including some new forms of activism and advocacy that emerged during that time. All right, so let me first give some numbers. So this graph that you can see shows the international enrollments in Japan. First, there has been a sharp increase in international enrollments since 2010, which peaked around 2019, the year before the pandemic. That helped to exceed the international student plan, 300,000 international student plan, which was set by the government as a goal for 2020, actually. So it was exceeded the year before. However, similarly to other countries, the pandemic impacted negatively those trends. And first they had a decline by about 10% in 2020. But then since the international travel ban introduced by the Japanese government continued longer, so they saw a continued decrease in 2021. This will be also the trend for Australia, because Australia, along with Japan, had some restrictive border policies as their COVID response. And in this year, we are seeing first signs of recovery, but still not the same, not at the same level as the pre-pandemic levels. So in my first study, I actually focused on the research gaps, such as excessive focus on the numeric targets, on, for example, numbers of international students and numbers of programs provided in English in Japan, instead of support and integration of international students. And here we can also see some competing priorities, which on one hand, there is this agenda of integrating and retaining as many international graduates as possible as highly skilled foreign professionals. And this is a goal that is pursued by METI, by a Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry in Japan. While at the same time, they are not developing migration policies per se, and immigration law is still quite restrictive, which reflects, you know, conservative stance of Japanese government, and this perception of Japanese society as being distrustful, not just of foreigners, but of basically all newcomers. It's relatively difficult for a Japanese person to move from city to city or from prefecture to prefecture. And there is a host of literature showing how people used volunteering as a way to integrate into their new community. So I thought it's quite interesting. And also in the absence of really inclusive immigration law, integration of foreign residents that are already in local communities is basically left to local civil society groups. In this first study, I used the concept of social capital, which means social networks and norms of trust and reciprocity. In this social capital theory, there are a couple of gaps that I found quite relevant to this case study. So first, there is this lack of agreement among scholars whether social capital can be generated in the short term. Particularly first social capital theories, they really focused on long-term building social capital, thinking that it can take decades and sometimes even centuries to build social capital. So that would be quite pessimistic for international students who are, you know, for just a few years, from 2 to 4 years in the host country. So that would mean that it's impossible for them to build social capital. And the second debatable aspect of social capital theory was the impact of diversity on social capital levels, which was also called a constrict claim. And that constrict claim made by Robert Putnam in 2007 was actually generated a lot of research, a lot of studies, which came up with often contradictory results. So that sort of guided my study whether or not social capital can be generated in the short term in diverse groups. So that was the main research question for this first study on Japan. And I used the case of interactions between international students and local civil society groups as my case study to check this. And I used quite a broad definition of civil society, as you can see, which allowed me, for example, to include informal hobby groups as also civil society, as long as they have some kind of hierarchy, organizers, leaders, and some kind of structure, for example, relatively regular meeting schedule and some activities planned and things like that, and some online presence. I already counted them as a civil society group. The data collection had two phases: the pre-pandemic phase, mainly done in 2017-2018 in Western Japan. This is the Kansai area, second most important economic area of Japan after Tokyo metropolitan area. And I used mainly ethnographic approach, like participant observation, interviews, and textual analysis. However, during the pandemic, I refocused more on students, because it was a new time and it was still not clear what kind of impact it's been having on them and how they are coping with this new situation. And also due to the pandemic restrictions, I switched to digital ethnography, like many researchers during that time. All right, well, the second study was a comparative study, as I mentioned, and it looked into the response of international student support organizations to the COVID-19 crisis. For this study, I used human security paradigm applied to international students first in 2010. For this, data collection was done in New South Wales at 4 universities. I studied at Macquarie University, one of those 4, and I studied there in 2019 in my exchange program. However, most field work was done in February 2020, right before everything closed for the pandemic. There were first signs of the pandemic going on already, such as ban against the travel ban against China, which I will cover later. All right, and this is the overlap that I mentioned. So I also used these interviews with international students done in Japan for the comparison purposes. So since I covered already the situation in Japan in terms of international enrollments, let me just show that there are similar trends in Australia, probably a little bit more dramatic even in terms of impact. There is an even bigger decline, and there is also much bigger international student population, and the impact on, for example, those stranded overseas during the pandemic was also quite serious in terms of numbers. The exact numbers of both countries, for example, in 2020 are not known, but the estimates are 500,000 for Australia and 147,000 for Japan. So quite considerable numbers for both countries. And similar to Japan, we can see some signs of recovery in January, February 2023, according to the latest information I found. So I also wanted to give some highlights of the groups that I found during my field work, and I just divided them in 2 big groups based on location, on campus and off campus. And you can see in this table that there are quite similar types of on-campus groups, but the different ones are highlighted in red font. So in Australia, you have so-called student collectives, for example, Queer Collective, Women's Collective, International Student Collective, that are basically advocacy groups. They are doing marches, protests, and advocate for the rights of this specific group. And also they have branches of political parties and religious groups on campus, which is not something that is allowed in Japan or practiced in Japan. So that is quite different. And we will see how it also plays out in functionality of those groups. In off-campus groups, there are actually more differences. So, for example, in Australia, there is a self-organized coordinated agency for international students on the national level, which is called CISA, while this kind of body or coordinated agency is not really available in Japan. Probably, again, due to the mainly apolitical nature of Japanese organizations. Maybe there are some other reasons. Related to government affiliations, there are two types of government affiliated groups. Some of them have been started by local governments as a part of the internationalization strategy or sister city movement in 1980s or 1990s. And some of them are affiliated to central government in a sense that they are being sponsored by MEXT, and MEXT is a Ministry of Education of Japan. So again, I wasn't able to find that kind of group in my sample, at least in New South Wales. Next, there are some differences in how the non-profit organizations are presented. They are much more restricted in Japan, and the range is much more limited, while in Australia, those charities, they tend to cover a huge range of issues from legal to job hunting, mental health, sexual health, religious-based organization, all sorts of groups. Some functional differences I mentioned already, such as absence of political or religious groups on campus in Japan. And I must say that there are some exceptions, such as religious universities. For example, if it's a Christian university or Buddhist university, you will have a religious organization of this specific congregation on campus, but no others. And as for political parties, I really wasn't able to find any exceptions. Again, that was before the pandemic. Advocacy groups, as I said, are present in Australia, but not in Japan. We will see how the things will start to shift during the pandemic as well. The emphasis in Japan tends to be on cultural activities, especially traditional culture such as tea ceremony, calligraphy, flower arrangement, and things like that. And the problem with this is that although it's quite beautiful and spectacular, definitely interesting, but it's not a type of culture that is actively practiced by many Japanese people today. So to what extent it's helpful for foreigners to get to know in depth that kind of culture that is not really representative or helpful for them to understand local customs of today is a little bit questionable. While in Australia, I found a lot of emphasis on social activities, just like coffee hour, or walking tours, or pizza parties, something that can actually bring people together, and people from different backgrounds can do it together. While in Japan, there is a lot of emphasis on differences rather than similarities. And also the difficult topics, because something that would be controversially would be avoided. And the emphasis is always on seeking harmony and entertaining, you must say, rather than trying to solve, trying to discuss deeper issues or trying to solve problems. So that is the functional differences. Again, before the pandemic, the impact as the emphasis was, as I said, on cultural exchange, and you can see that bright picture with kimono as one of the examples. The reliance was very much on face-to-face interaction. So events involving cooking, eating, drinking were really, really popular, and that, of course, became impossible during the pandemic. All right, so in order to understand whether or not they actually created that social capital, I used some kind of criteria based on the previous literature, which was relevant to that specific sample. And you can see those criteria, and they include, for example, mutual help or providing information and resources. And by this, I don't mean, of course, providing official information or guidance through organization, but the members exchanging on their own initiative some kind of tips of surviving in this radically different society. Then they were developing shared norms within groups, forming friendships, professional connections, connections, sometimes creating new networks within the existing groups, returning participants, and staying in touch with organizations. Some of the best practices or factors conducive to forming social capitals was intentionality, to what extent they were actually intentional about creating those ties. And those organizations that were intentional, they tended to offer a series of events or programs instead of just one-time events that may be very enjoyable, but then, you know, if the participants never see each other again, it's really hard to establish a trustful relationship. Things like flexibility of the organizational schedule was something that was highlighted by many. Also offering room for international students initiative, allowing them to participate in event planning and decision making, having a common goal to pursue an intrinsic interest in the activity and good coordination. Avoiding those things that I put in the text box on the right hand, such as pressure to volunteer or mismatch of motivation or values. And in case if that arises, have some kind of adequate mitigation, for which intercultural training became really important. Well, in the second study that I mentioned, which was a comparative study, I looked into the impact of the pandemic on international students first, and I found those 5 areas. First of all, social life and relationships were heavily affected, especially when it comes to things like loneliness and isolation. That was quite severe for the newcomers in the country and in the city as well. It also heavily affected studies, particularly for those who were stranded overseas. That was, you know, they faced a host of quite specific challenges, such as from technical ones related to internet connection or firewall, to more mental ones like mismatch between expectations to actually go to a new country and experience new culture and make new friends, and the reality of just studying alone in the room in front of the computer the whole day. So this perception also lagging behind those classmates that were lucky enough to get into the destination country. Decreased quality of online classes was also highlighted by some. Obviously, there were aspects related to physical and mental health and finances and career planning. I'll probably skip those ones, not because they are unimportant, but because they were highlighted by so many researchers and practitioners before, such as loss of part-time jobs and income. One interesting aspect that came up only in interviews done with international students enrolled in Australian universities was this perceived unfairness, unfair treatment, and they came up in the context of international tuition fees being 4 times higher than the domestic ones. At the same time, international students were not allowed to use Medicare, which is a standard insurance available for Australians only. So international students were not covered, and they found it very unfair. And they started questioning to what extent Australia was a multicultural society. All right, related to the Japanese organizations' response to the pandemic, I must say that many of them were not able to adjust very quickly. So first, once the in-person events became impossible, university clubs and circles just stopped recruiting new members and just closed everything. While those groups founded by local governments that I mentioned earlier went silent for months and sometimes even years, partly because of the fact that many members were elderly people, retired people already, who were really unfamiliar with this new online technology, but it was not always the case. So for instance, one of the leaders in Osaka that I interviewed, he was a professional working in an international company, so obviously he was more than familiar with Zoom meetings and other technology, and yet he said that our members think it's essential to meet directly and share the same experience. I feel quite strong hesitations against online meetings like Zoom. So it was, I think, more of a cultural preference I think, more than just technological challenges. At the same time, on-campus peer support groups and also mixed sponsored groups that I mentioned earlier, they turn to Zoom and social media quite actively. So you can see on your screen a picture of online tea ceremony. So tea ceremony again, but in a different format. And informal groups such as, for example, drawing circles or other hobby groups, they continued meeting in a hybrid mode online whenever in-person meetings were impossible, or when it was safe, they were meeting, for example, outdoors with precautions like social distancing. Interestingly enough, the international students' response to the online format in Japan was quite mixed. So some students said they were unsatisfied or just even unwilling to participate. So some of them said, when it's only on Zoom, there's no share for me, there's no real interaction, the online wall is too thick. Others compared this atmosphere to class setting. They said there was some kind of hesitance to speak up. It feels stiffer, it feels more distant. At the same time, other students, especially those studying remotely from overseas, they complained about shortage of certain online events. So it was quite mixed and quite difficult to tell what to do if you are a provider. As for Australia, I must say the Australian organizations adapted much faster. They switched to virtual events during the first weeks of the first lockdown in 2020. And they provided a wide range of events, as you can see on the screen. They provided online conferences on sexual health and also on how the COVID-19 affected the visa status, and also they gave a voice, they tried to raise the voice of those international students that were stranded overseas. And that was organized by CISA. There was also political parties' involvement in both countries. First, in Australia, this first travel ban against China was framed not as a public health need, but as a racist response. And at the Sydney University, they even started a petition and collected almost 6,000 signatures to end the travel ban. Well, obviously this situation and this perception changed once they became global. While also some parties outside, mainly socialist parties, got involved. First, they were reluctant to get involved in the international student case because they perceived many of them as coming from bourgeois background, so not really their clientele. And as for Japan, the government during the pandemic started discussing providing financial aid to foreign residents. It was for the first time in history, including international students and foreign trainees. And some of the nonprofits started posting online the updates of the debate, which may not seem very important, but in Japanese reality, when most organizations are apolitical, very active in service provision and very passive in political advocacy, this is quite a big change. And also there were some protest movements, first related to the Black Lives Matter global movement. They had some marches in Japan, and the picture on the right, it shows this march in Kyoto in June 2021. While there was a local case of human rights abuse related to Vishma Sandamali's death in Nagoya Detention Center. She was a former international student who was not able to afford her tuition fee. She was 33 years old at the time of her death. So she dropped out of the university. She overstayed her visa. She stayed at her boyfriend's house and especially experienced the domestic violence. She came to the police to complain about it. And the police discovered that she was overstaying her visa, so she was put in this detention center instead. So basically it's a prison. She developed some physical symptoms. She was not able to get appropriate medical care, and eventually she died. And this case, of course, attracted huge media attention, both in Japan and internationally also. And there were some marches trying to change this situation for the asylum seekers because she applied for asylum as well, and yet she was still put in the detention center, which is unfortunately still a common practice in Japan if asylum seeker overstays his or her visa. Finally, there was this advocacy for the students stranded overseas, and one event I already mentioned, this event organized by CSA in Australia. There were also campaigns on Twitter and Facebook organized by some newly emerged organizations in Japan. It was a little bit different because the members of these organizations were all Japanese language schools, so they were losing financially because international students were not able to come and study the language. And there were some issues because they kind of misrepresented all international students in Japan as language learners. However, my interviewees still found their activities very helpful for them to kind of mentally and emotionally cope with this situation. So as Simon mentioned, there will be a fourth coming book with Routledge in July, so in 2 months from now, and this covers the Japan's case and also the pandemic impact that I mentioned. So if you are curious, I encourage you to check it out. And in conclusion, I just wanted to say that I also found very helpful the framework that was introduced by Professor Tran in her invited editorial in the Journal of International Students in 2022, where she said that there were 3 main areas in which international students were devalued during the pandemic. The first being commercialization and dehumanization. And I found that this aspect was stronger in Australia based on my interviews and also my own experience of studying there. It's probably not surprising because Australia definitely pursues this commercial side of international education a lot more than Japan, that is still pursuing kind of aid approach versus trade approach like in Australia. Instead, othering appears stronger in Japan. And international students complained a lot of increased staring during the pandemic, and other things that are unfortunately quite common in Japanese society. The second pillar that Professor Tran highlighted was essentialization as a homogeneous and deficit group. And that was experienced, I would say, equally by both international students in Japan and in Australia. Another challenge that was common was this number of international students stranded overseas for months and years. In terms of response, Australian organizations adapted to this new normal much faster, while many Japanese groups could not adapt and remain paralyzed for, again, months and years. Instead, some other groups in Japan displayed unusual political activism, and new organizations emerged and new forms of civic engagement also emerged. Some students also proactively searched for solutions outside their usual supporters and usual university-based network, and in some cases it led to transnational activism instances, as I was trying to show. That's all from me. I'll probably stop sharing now. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to hearing your comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Polina. That's a very rich data set, and you've taken us into more than one set of issues there. And it's really interesting to hear about your work on refugees and asylum seekers. And Wishma's story is quite alarming and not untypical. I think these situations are arising for many in many countries. It's a terrible situation to be in that marginal zone, and you have very little right to talk. One of the things that emerged for me out of a decade of work on international students was that mobile populations just don't have a rights framework. In the commercial international education countries, there's a kind of commercial rights are established so that if you're, if you're lucky, you've got legislation that protects you if your private college goes bust and you've lost your fees. You get your fees back eventually, well, some of them. But all the other rights, all the civil and legal and human rights, industrial protections and so on, not there. And you rely on the organisations that you're connected with to advocate for you in situations, and that's not always reliable. Universities set limits on set boundaries on what they can and can't do, should and shouldn't do because of the demands on their services. And if you've got associations in civil society, you've at least got some networks for potential protection, maybe access to professional help like lawyers and so on when you need them. But it's not enough for a lot of people. There's nothing, and it's worse for refugees, worse for asylum seekers than it is for international students who are at least valued nominally by the countries they're in. Asylum seekers and refugees not valued, and a prima facie tendency to want to push them out again in the populations and in the political systems. So really important work, because mobile populations are going to increase around the world as we get more climate refugees and others. And this continuing, we've got a rise in military conflict around the world, more international situations which are driving people out of countries. And of course, all the, but perhaps ecologically, that's going to be the biggest, climate refugees are going to be the biggest category of all. I'm going to ask you a couple of things. Firstly, your theoretical framework of social capital, much used and to some extent debated as well as a framework. Are you working with a Bourdieuian approach? Are you taking on all of the other concepts like field and habitus and so on, interchangeability of capitals, all those sorts of things? How far has social capital got you in terms of your own inquiry? Is it a satisfactory framework for you? Do you see the need to supplement it in some way?
Thank you very much for this great question. I actually was relying much more on Robert Putnam's work,
right,
American sociologist, more than Pierre Bourdieu approach. Although I am definitely aware of this, and that can be, this field of habitus and other concept that he introduced, cultural capital as well, human capital. That could be very productive ways to go on with this as well. I was also using the work of Coleman, another American sociologist who first, at least to the best of my knowledge, he first applied it to education sphere, actually, and social capital produced by the family. To what extent I find it satisfying? Well, there is a lot of criticism, honestly, and one of them, of course, this is a concept that is notoriously elusive and difficult to measure if you're not using some kind of proxies. And second, many scholars say that it's been gender blind also, so that's another problem with this theory. So definitely there are some areas of improvement there as well. And if I may just say something, very quickly comment on something that you touched upon earlier regarding this Vishma Sandamali's case. I wasn't probably clear enough in my presentation because I was trying so desperately to fit within the time limit. But I should have said that I don't really consider this case as a common case or typical case for an international student in Japan. Definitely not. I wanted to say that, yes, it's exceptional in so many ways, and yet it highlights some precarity that international students may be facing in case they lose their status for some reason, and not necessarily even in such a dramatic case as Vishma's case, but also possibly the issue of transitional visas. And I mean by that very few international students are lucky enough to transition to a working visa immediately after graduation. So they transition from student status to a professional working visa. Most of them require some time to look for jobs. While Australia provides this post-study working rights, Japan doesn't really do that. Instead, they provide some kind of transitional visas that last up to 6 months, sometimes 3 months with extensions. And those are two types. First, a cultural activity visa, and another one, this one doesn't allow you to work part-time at all. So it's very hard to make money to survive. It allows you to do some kind of unpaid internships. And another one is designated activity that does allow you to work part-time. That is a little bit difficult still to get, and you need to show, for example, that you have enough money in your bank account to survive, and so many other things. So it's quite difficult to get, and there is this a huge area of precarity, even without these dramatic circumstances that I described. So I just wanted to make this kind of disclaimer, although it's not a typical case by any means. There is this problem of precarity related to international students.
Yeah. I've got another question, but it's about culture, but I might come back to it later. We've got some more people queuing up to ask you a question. Rupa Trilokeka is an important scholar of international mobility in Canada, has put a question in the chat. Rupa, I gather, doesn't want to come on camera. So let's have a look at that question now, Polina. You can see it there, I think.
I can see a question only from Akiyoshi Onizawa.
No, that's certainly coming up later. And we've got Nadia Ivanenko as well. But just above Nadia, you can see Rupa. I think if you scroll up,
yeah,
I can read out the question for you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it would be great.
Yeah.
I cannot see it for some reason.
I was curious, read the last 2 points on the last slide. How and what forms of new organisation got formed, and why, in your opinion, were international students reaching out to them outside the university sector? And what are your conclusions regarding the social capital framework and the role of civil societies in this context?
Thank you for the great question, first of all. And let me go back to the last slide. I don't know, should I put it back on the screen maybe to make it a little easier for everyone to see what we are talking about? I cannot see it right now, sorry. Yeah, I think it should be here now. Okay, yeah. So the new organizations, that was the first question, right? And why they emerged? Well, first of all, kind of simple answer, new needs and new issues emerged, such as, for example, this huge number of international students stranded overseas. That was unprecedented. I mean, there were certainly students who struggled to get a visa or struggled to get in the country due to some kind of logistical or financial limitations before the pandemic as well. But these huge numbers, that was not seen before in either international education in Australia or in Japan. So definitely that was a new issue, and that sort of required some new response. That is why, for instance, this new organization that I mentioned here in this slide emerged. They have this long official name, Open the Borders for the Safe Study in Japan Association, which I never remembered, but most of them, they had this hashtag education is not tourism that they were using, and people knew this one. So that was the kind of first and maybe simplistic response to your question. So why new organizations emerged? And the second question, I think, oh, I'm sorry, could you remind me of the second question? I think I forgot what the second question was. The second part of the question. Simon, I cannot hear you. You are muted.
Oh, well, probably the best version of my voice, actually. I've got a bit of a cold. No, Rupa's put a question back in the chat, and she's saying, how and what forms of new organisations got formed, and why, in your opinion, was IS international students reaching out to them outside the university sector? And what are your conclusions re social capital framework and the role of civil society in this context?
Thank you. Yes, I can see it in the chat right now. I'm sorry for your voice. Yeah, please spare your voice for the rest of the webinar at least. And
I won't say a word.
related, you know, to the second part of the question, obviously, you know, some of the ways that social capital was formed before the pandemic, they were no longer working in this new situation. So this whole debate of whether or not social capital can be formed online and to what extent and what kind of social capital, that is a new, you know, completely new area for my research, which I partly covered in this, I think it was the 5th chapter of my book, which I wrote as a part of my postdoctoral project, this response of civil society groups to the pandemic and how their interaction with international students has necessarily changed, of course, in this new, completely new environment. So I am touching upon this, but I'm aware of my limitations because it's a huge new area, the role of technology in this process. So we are now in this sort of virtual environment. I'm not in Japan physically. I'm actually in London in the hotel in Heathrow. I just arrived less than 24 hours ago, but we are still in a kind of virtual setting. So to what extent we are forming social capital, to what extent it's more effective or less effective compared to the situation if we were sharing, you know, physical space together. So that's still a big question, and there's no definite answer that would fit everything. So personally, I made a lot of connections. I was still an international student during that time, and I participated in all possible online events, and I found it effective for making connections. But at the same time, many interviewees that I spoke to, and I spoke to 22 students from 14 countries on that topic, they were not as positive. I mean, not all as positive. So huge, I would say, is huge diversity in responses. And if you are curious to find out more, again, I can encourage you to check my book on this specific chapter on the pandemic. I can see some other questions that I can read.
Let me manage it.
Okay, thank you.
The next question is from Nadia Ivanenko. So Nadia's had 2 questions in the chat already. So come in, Nadia.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Polina, first of all, for your interesting presentation and this important and essential topic that you raised here about civil education and international education. I have 2 questions. The first one actually is about, have you made any research what nationalities are included in your research group of international students, or just general picture? And the second one is, what are the most positive effects that civil society has on students' academic success or development, if there are any? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the great question. Related, first of all, to nationalities, I think I even included in the slides the 14 countries that I interviewed for the pandemic. I didn't really specifically focus on those countries because honestly, I was just using convenience sample and snowball sampling during the pandemic. So asked the international students to introduce their friends who would be willing to be interviewed on that topic. And yeah, related to dominant, that probably does not really represent the entire picture. I was also focusing on graduate students studying in English, and that is not the whole international student body, because of course there are some students who are studying in Japanese. They mainly come from Asian countries, particularly with the Chinese character background or, you know, similar grammar. So Chinese, Korean, Taiwanese students, they tend to study in Japanese-based programs, although not always, not 100%, but this tends to be the case. Okay, so that is a little bit different probably for, and they also tend to be enrolled in a bachelor level program, so undergraduate program, rather than postgraduate. Related to the second part of the question, positive effects on academics. I wasn't specifically focusing on that, although this is definitely very, very interesting topic. I was mainly focusing on things like, making connections or well-being, emotional, mental, and things like that. What it can have definitely a positive effect is, for example, relationship with the like negative relationship to the dropout level. So, for instance, students who who are successful in making connections in the host country, they are less likely to drop out. But again, in order to make kind of confident claims like that, I probably would have done a little bit different type of study, more like quantitative or mixed, at least relying on some kind of larger scale data, while I was just doing qualitative interviews with quite limited number of students. So it's not enough, probably not a kind of persuasive evidence enough. But yeah, I was just kind of exploring this issue at that point. I don't know to what extent it answers your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nadia. Thanks, Polina. The next question is from Aki Yanazawa. Akiyoshi, come in, please. You've got two questions, in fact, and both interesting and both comparative.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. So the maybe you can see my question from the chat. So let me just say the background of this. So you already mentioned that your especially sample of the student in Japan is more like the graduate student who are in the program in English. And my question is based on a much more conceptual or the theoretical background that when you talk about the social capital, that is much more like a universal social capital, such as the Francis Fukushima or the Fukuyama or the partner, right? But if you go into the many, like much more the bonding social capital among the very kind of the ethnic group, and then the bonding social capital to make a kind of bridge between the two different social, the ethnic group, social group, that is could be more to some degree feasible when we think about the kind of a very heterogenic nature of the international student in any country. And especially in case of Japan, maybe the Chinese students, especially from the student from mainland China, is really the crucial group. And they are the largest group both in Australia and Japan. And then the international relationship really matters on this aspect. So I do admit that this is true that probably compared with Australia, the student engagement, the commitment of the student is involvement of student is not visible and then not active. That must be kind of universal, the aspect of the Japanese society. But having said so, if you see at least the Japanese speaking world, they are becoming much more active than the ordinary time in the pandemic period. Mm-hmm. And then what we face in Japan from the kind of the geopolitical point of view is that we do learn a lot from the Black Lives Matter in United States. And then the Japanese could be a target of the discrimination or the attack if you go to the North America. That was kind of the situation we faced with that. And then we feel some kind of sympathy to the Asians. That is one point. The other point is that this is just after the umbrella revolution in Hong Kong. So the people are really cautious about how to make a kind of voice. Both among the Chinese group and also the Japanese group. So that is one of the background I can easily guess on this. So my question is going back to the kind of very theoretical one is it really possible to make some kind of generic argument of the social capital in your approach, or do you think it is good to have other approach to divide the different groups or admit the existence of the different groups within an international student?
Thank you very much. Thank you. Great questions. I'm not so sure if I can possibly, answer them in a satisfying manner in the remaining time, but I will try my best. So first of all, related to the Chinese students, again, I'm not sure if I'm in a position to answer this question very well, because I was not focusing on Chinese students specifically. I was focusing on all international students from all ethnic and national backgrounds studying in English. I was looking into EMI, also English medium instruction in Japan. So I had some Chinese interviewees in both countries, but obviously in Australia everyone studies in English, so that's not an issue. But in Japan, you have this distinctive bilingual education. You have Japanese-based programs and English-based programs. So I was focusing on the latter. And I had some Chinese interviewees studying in those programs as well. But I didn't really, highlight any specificities of this group, although it's definitely worth looking into. Next fascinating point that you made, also I'm looking at the typed comment that is in the chat, is the impact of the structure of higher education system in each country on social capital and on how they interact with international students. Again, this is a huge area, and the first thing that comes to my mind is, of course, completely different. Beside the linguistic situation that we mentioned already, is also the different approach to international education. While Japan pursues this more kind of aid-based approach, so they issue a lot of scholarships to international students, particularly from developing countries, and they have a lot of Asian recipients. So most scholarships, they actually target the same countries as, for instance, JICA and other aid providing government aid providing agencies are targeting. So you can see really this kind of scholarship and fellowship system in Japan following the same kind of logic as the foreign aid approach, while in Australia, they definitely moved from aid to trade, as some researchers say. So it's definitely commercialized. They don't really care very much from which country you come from. As long as you pay the international tuition fee, you are good. And it's quite difficult to get a scholarship covering your study being an international student. So that is one thing, and that I think sort of explains why international students made this comment of unfairness in Australia much more than in Japan. Actually, I didn't have this kind of specific word come up in interviews. They complained about other things, including some of the, as you mentioned, anti-Asian sentiment. And definitely there was this in Japan, especially at the beginning stages, when they sort of put blame on China and certain other countries on for spreading the virus and complicating life for the rest of the countries. So definitely there was this at the beginning, at least, and complaints about staring, which can be seen as xenophobic or even racist behavior. So yes, there was this difference, but definitely there is a lot more things to cover. Thank you. I'm not sure if I answered completely your question, but I think that's the best I could manage in this.
Thank you very much, and I learned a lot. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate all of that from both of you. I think we can squeeze in Zach Spire before we close. We usually go 5 minutes over. So, Zach, are you there, please? Here he comes.
You are muted.
Zach, we can't hear a word. No sound, Zach.
I'm very sorry. Can you hear me now, colleagues?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Okay. Thanks, Polina. My two questions are written out very long, but I'll try to keep it shorter. Using the social capital lens you have for your work, can you maybe speak to some of the ethical issues you think your work raised? I know you've done this throughout the question period, but maybe some of the highlights, some of the things you think further work might redress going forward. And then sort of in addition, could you talk about how your work highlights the shift during COVID-19 from material spaces of universities to these digital platforms, and how your notes earlier said there was also this great rush back to the material spaces, and kind of maybe some of the tensions you saw in that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zach. And I'm not quite sure about the first part of the question. If you could elaborate a little bit what exactly you mean by ethical issues that arose from using social capital lens, it would be easier for me maybe to.
Okay, I'm sorry. Your own ethical approach to the issues you think. For me, the social capital lens highlights what people's perceptions and attitudes towards their relations focus on, or what they focus on in their social relations. My question is, given how you've highlighted the differential treatment across different groups and within the groups you've studied, could you maybe discuss kind of, what is the ethical responsibility of universities or non-university organizations to redress some of the issues you found?
Thank you. Yes, again, the very broad question, very, I'm really not sure if I can answer in a satisfying manner, but I will try. So definitely, there was a lot of issues related to trust and issues related in terms of differences, especially. Social capital in Japan is characterized by belonging to traditional networks. So people who are not a part of these traditional networks or ties, they are automatically excluded. So that is, of course, the case for all foreigners and international students in particular. The second issue that is specific for international students, they are temporary stayers, sojourners, right? So they are not supposed to stay in a country by definition for a longer period of time, which can be also quite discouraging in terms of social capital. So local people may feel reluctant to invest their time and energy in creating ties with those who are supposed to leave anyway. And some international students as well, they may be quite passive, and that was something that was highlighted by some organizations, leaders as well. So not all were motivated to make connections, meaningful connections in the host country, because they were foreseeing that they would leave anyway. And related to the second part of the question, and sorry, the ethical responsibility, again, that was of universities. Again, that was not the center of my research, but what the research has brought up was the need for more effective coordination between the actors. So, for example, if an external organization is coming up with some kind of event, the university needs to adjust their schedule, at least in a way that there is no, for example, schedule clash, right, between these events, so that international students can actually join. And yeah, things like that. It's not necessarily some kind of huge issues, but for example, one of the groups in Osaka University was running a very successful host family program for 20 years already. And this was possible largely because of their collaboration with local civil society groups in the area. So they were able to delegate many of the responsibilities from the university staff to those members, including mitigating things with families and students and matching all of that. So that was maybe one of the good example of best practices. So the second part of the question was the shift from material to digital spaces and a kind of pushback. I definitely saw this pushback in Japan, especially when many of the organizations just stopped providing their activities simply because they used to rely on those facilities that were provided by local governments for gathering and doing the events, and the facilities were closed, so they just couldn't come up with a different solution, for example, for that period. So again, maybe a little bit too specific, not necessarily what the kind of answer that you were expecting, but that what comes up for me at the moment.
Thanks, Polina. I think we've best call it a day given the time. But I think your presentation was very good today, and the core questions and discussion have been good as well. Do invite you back when your book launches are happening. There are 2 books coming out, and I think we welcome the chance to host you again. When you're ready to talk about those books, and that the best time is when they're available. So do come back, folks. We're suspending the webinar program next week because we have CG's annual conference, big event for us. Monday, we have a face-to-face conference at UCL Institute of Education in London, and that is all advertised on our website. And you can also live stream into that conference as well as attending if you're in the UK. And free of charge, but you do need to register for both live stream and physical attendance. Then we've got the online conference, the World Conference, the Global Conference on Tuesday. And that will run like a succession of webinars going all day from 9 till 5 with keynotes and with panels and so on, but with breaks in between sessions. So you won't have to sit there in front of a screen and just watch us continually. There will be opportunity for Q&A in all sessions. And so, as I said, will be like a succession of webinars using the same broad format of 1 hour per session, with about 20 minutes of Q&A in each session. So do come into the online conference if you're outside the UK. If you're inside the UK, you can come into both face-to-face and online conferences. There won't be a webinar next Thursday. We'll all be recovering from our endeavours over Monday and Tuesday. But the following week, we start again in the normal sequence of Tuesdays and Thursdays with a webinar from Yusuf Aldak on the 30th of May, which will continue the theme of future global academic mobility, which Polina has so capably talked about today. So thank you again, Polina, and thank you everyone for coming. And let me just say bye for now.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you for the invitation. And I'm looking forward to seeing you on Monday as well. I've registered for the in-person
See you there.
conference in
Good.
London. Yeah, see you. Bye, everyone.